Well, thank you, everyone, so much for having us. I'm very excited to be here. This session is data mining for social impact, the perfect post-lunch session. We're going to talk about statistics and modeling and all these things that we all love so much in our day-to-day job. But I want to begin by talking about actually what is data, right? We're at this thing called data on purpose. We're supposed to be talking about data. We use this word all of the time, and yet so often we, I think, are talking across each other. Because data, we think it's this thing that we can touch and feel and play with, but it's not, right? When we talk about data, we can often be talking about lots of different things. So what is data? Well, if you go to Google Images, as every good research project begins with, you find things like this tunnel of ones and zeros, or a world of ones and zeros with the sun of big data coming over the horizon. You find whatever this is. I still don't understand this picture. And apparently it's big, right? We all talk about big data and what it is. But what really is data? So I think that data is a raw resource. And what I mean by that is that data in and of itself is not valuable, right? Just like crude oil coming out of the ground is only valuable because of the things that you can do with it, data is only valuable because of the things that you can do with it. It's a raw resource. It requires us to go and manipulate it, to apply processes and methods to it, to extract value. But in and of itself, it's not valuable. There's this quote that I love that's basically, it's by this sculptor, and it says, inside of every block of stone is a sculpture, and it's the goal of the artist to unleash it. Right? The same thing is true with data. Inside of our data are insights and ideas and new innovations, and it's our job to apply the tools and to chisel away and apply methods and extract that value. So what is data? It's this raw resource. It's really when the experiences, thoughts, movements, places, ideas, interactions, and more are captured and stored, right? And I think this is at least for me, has been a helpful way to think about data. Like when I drove to this conference this morning, you could say there was data associated with that because my cell phone was on and maybe even my car was tracking me. You never know these days. And it was because somebody took the time to capture and store that movement with the goal of extracting value from it later, being able to use it later, right? Had I walked here without any devices or things like that, that journey would not have been data, right? So there's this idea that something becomes data when we decide to capture and store it and extract value from it. So then what is data mining? This session is about data mining, and I think it's a broad term. I think that data mining is really, it's what incorporates the many methods and tools that we use to extract the value from the raw resource of data, right? Data mining are the methods and the tools that we decide to employ. So I want to talk about one set of methods and tools, or one kind of problem set, or one kind of thing that we can do with data and what data mining can unlock. And that is the role of prediction. In our sector, we tend to be very interested in causality, right? We tend, when we think about monitoring and evaluation, things like this, we tend to answer very causal questions. Did my program cause something to happen? Does this intervention cause the world to become a better place? But there's actually a whole other set of questions, of predictive questions, that are also valuable. One way to think about this, the rain dance and the umbrella, right? The rain dance, it's a causal question, right? If I do the rain dance, does that cause it to rain? Right? And that's an important question, it's an interesting question, and there's lots of interesting causal questions. The umbrella question is slightly different. It's, can I predict that it will rain, and that will prompt me to take an intervention, to take a step, to take an action, and that's bring my umbrella. That's a predictive question. And our world is full of both causal and predictive questions. And as a sector, I think we have been very heavily focused on causal questions, and I think I want to make the case that there's a lot of interesting predictive questions as well that can greatly inform the way that we work. So I want to talk, though, a minute about why this is, in some ways, a pretty fundamental change. And that's because these two sets of questions, the tools that you use to answer them, come from two different camps, right? They're fundamentally, in some ways, different tools to use. On the causal side, the causal tools, they tend to come from things like regression analysis and randomized control trials. We've talked about some of these things today. There was actually a great question earlier about randomized control trials and the fact that they're still the gold standard, but it's really, really expensive and time-consuming, right? So we have these kind of causal tools at our disposal, and they tend to be grounded in and come from social science, right? These tools come out of economics and statistics and sociology and those kinds of research disciplines, right? On the predictive side, you have other kinds of models, right? You have things called random forests and this whole thing called machine learning, and it comes more from the computer sciences, right? A totally fundamentally different set of disciplines in some ways. Right? I've been working at the University of Chicago for a while and in a research center where a lot of our work is trying to bring together social scientists and computer scientists. And it's amazing because they speak very different languages sometimes, right? They're like, they don't even understand. Like, you have a computer scientist who are like, this RCT thing, it's such crap. Like, why do you guys even go through that? And you have economists that are like, this computer scientist, you don't know anything about the world. Like, all you do is play at your computer all day. And they just talk across each other, right? And they're fundamentally different tool sets. And so as we as a sector start wrestling with predictive questions, we have to ask ourselves, what are the tools that we need to answer those questions? And we can't necessarily rely on the tools that we've used answering causal questions. That said, the line between causation and prediction is beginning to blur, right? We have, especially in the computer science side, more and more of the tools and the models and the methods being used for causal interpretation in a way that they weren't 5 or even 10 years ago, right? Where you have some Bayesian inference and things like this that are doing some very interesting things applying computer science models to causal questions, right? So these things are beginning to blur, but for the sake of argument, let's say like these are fundamentally different tool sets, and the tool sets that we've been using in the past isn't necessarily the only tools we want to use in the future. I want to line up one other dichotomy before we dive into our discussion, and this is the dichotomy between prediction and best practices. There's a lot of people right now talking about best practices, and I think doing a lot of really good work trying to promote best practices and make them more available to programs and to nonprofits. But they're talking about them in the terms and in the language of prediction. They're saying if you follow these best practices, I can predict your outcomes. And I just want to investigate that question for a minute and see what we can do to hopefully pull it apart. Okay, best practice. This is generally drawn from the academic literature, right? They tend to base a lot of, they extrapolate from randomized control trials, things like that, right? So it's generally saying, hey, we've done this big RCT, this is what we learned. Now, if you kind of do this exact same program, you'll have this exact same result, right? And the level of granularity is the program, right? The level of granularity in this system is the program. And what I mean by that is that it's hard to differentiate between similar programs. Two programs that are implementing the exact same best practices, in theory, should have the exact same outcomes, right? The two programs that are implementing the same best practices should have the same outcomes. And yet we know that's not true, right? I think we can do better than that. Prediction can come from a variety of data sources. It can come from proprietary data, open data, closed data, all these different things we've been talking about. And models can be designed for each program, for each intervention, for each site. It can ingest and handle lots more information when making predictions. And the level of granularity tends to be, or can be, the individual. So that means this allows for programs that might appear quite similar to be differentiated. Right? Two programs that are implementing the same best practices, as I believe that we should promote best practices and do all those kind of things, two programs that are implementing the same best practices, under a predictive model, you could say, oh, they're serving slightly different populations, or they're working in slightly different ways, or the people that they're serving are different, and so they're going to have different outcomes, right? So let's flesh this out with a little bit more of a visual example. In the best practice program, let's say I'm working with high school students. I'm trying to help them, let's say graduate from high school or achieve some sort of outcome. I'm working with 10 students. I'm implementing best practices. And according to the research, if I do this, 70% of my students will graduate. But that's essentially the same thing as every student has about a 70% chance of graduating, right? Every student has about a 70% chance of graduating. I can't differentiate between the students, right? They're all the same to me in this kind of best practice model. In the predictive program, I'm serving the 10 students. I'm also trying to achieve the same goal. And on aggregate, let's even say, 70% of them might graduate. But it allows me to say each of them have their own likelihood of graduating. And this is actually kind of interesting, right? Maybe I decide to spend more resources on the kid who I know from the outset will need a little bit more help, right? Maybe I spend a little bit less resources on the kids that are like so close to the finish line they just need a nudge to get over, right? It allows me to allocate my resources in a slightly different way. And I think there's actually a whole set of questions that we can answer using this kind of predictive thinking. So for example, if 500 people applied for my program and I can only let in 250, who should I let in, right? The way that we answer this question often tends to be the first 250 that applied, right? But that's probably not the best way to, if we're concerned about optimizing and maximizing outcomes, that's not the right 250 people to let in necessarily. So some of the work that we're even doing in my firm, the Impact Lab, we're actually working with organizations to help them think through this question and say, according to your preferences, however you might define success, or however you might define like the kind of population you want to help, right? Maybe you want to take the 250 kids that are at the bottom and move them up just a little bit. Maybe you want to help kids make the most growth. Whatever it is, we help you identify those 250 kids and say for your goals, for your values, for the change that you want to create in the world, we think these are probably, this is better than random. It's better than letting in the first 250 kids, right? This is some guidance on this. Other questions, like who should I apply more resources towards in order to achieve our goal? Or where should I allocate resources to help the highest number of people? Right? These are predictive questions. They're saying, where should I allocate resources in order to achieve a goal in the future? And these is obviously informed by the past and informed by information and data that we've already collected, but it's used to project forward and help us make better and different decisions. Other questions, who in my program would have succeeded anyway? I think this is one that we don't think about a lot, right? We need to, as a sector, we need to wake up and say, like, look, our impact is what happened because we existed minus what would have happened had we not existed, right? A lot of the kids that we help and try to graduate from high school would have graduated from high school anyways. And so we can actually begin to think about this in a much more nuanced way when we're able to maybe predict kids that might graduate from high school without our help. And should we really be allocating resources to them if our goal is purely to help kids graduate from high school? And lastly, what intervention should I give to someone to maximize outcomes? We work with some organizations around that are like referral organizations. And so we work, for example, with a homeless agency in Chicago that refers to other homeless agencies. And the way they're doing it is they're basically like, all right, when somebody calls our service, we look at the list and we say, oh, this is the most recent bed to open up. We'll just put them into this most recent bed, right? Like there's a better way to do this, right? And so we helped them. We said, oh, let's not every homeless person is the same. Not every program is the same. Let's look and see, can we match people to the kinds of programs that they're hoping to create that will maximize their own individual level outcomes? That's a very fundamentally different way of approaching our work, and I think a very important way of approaching our work. So in closing, best practices are important, but they are not predictive. Right? I think we have the opportunity to move beyond just saying generalizable sector-wide best practices, which I absolutely believe are important and absolutely should be better disseminated. But it allows us to move beyond that and say, for your program, for this time, for this student, for this person, here's the best way that we can help them. Right? We live in a world with massive challenges. Right? We are here because we want to see something change in the world around us. And yet we have limited resources to do that with. And we need to ask ourselves the hard questions about trade-offs and opportunity costs. And say, like, where's my time? Where's my energy? Where are my resources best spent? And I think for those kinds of questions, we need both causal tools and predictive tools. Data mining has the potential to dramatically change how the social sector works. I think the nonprofit sector, the civil society that we will have in 20 years will look vastly different than the one we have 20 years ago. And I think we're in the midst of a fundamental shift. I think we're seeing a shift where we are able to begin to, in closer to real time, at least infer what might maybe possibly be working, right? Like, I think, are approaching a time where the best marketed nonprofits, which always tend to it seems like beat the most effective nonprofits, might not be actually true. We can start to level the playing field for people, maybe just a little bit. And so I think these kind of discussions that we're having today, the work that I'm really excited to talk about with our panelists, is important. And it's important because it's going to help us make change in the way that we want to make change. It's going to help us do our jobs better. I think data mining has a critical role to play in that. So I want to start our conversation with our esteemed, very well-dressed panel. It's really making me look bad here. David, why don't we start with you? I'd love to hear more about your work at the family nonprofit that you work with, because you're actually doing a lot of interesting data mining work. So I'd love for you just to share a little bit about the work that you're doing and how you're applying the methods and tools of data mining and analytics more broadly to the goals of your organization.
Sure. So I work at the Family Independence Initiative, and so we partner with families across the country to make investments in the initiatives that they're taking in their communities. So we'll make various types of financial investments, loans, health matches, IDAs. And so in turn, these families then, we have an online system, and they provide information back to us through an online monthly journal. And so it's highly dimensional. We're collecting about 300 data points, then we pull in some other data as well to match against that. And so my job is to sort of go through that and try to sort of craft policy arguments that sort of to make this argument in the foundation world that if you think about the way that the nonprofit sector generally works right now, is foundation kicks money down to a nonprofit that decides what poor people should do, and then has this program, and then says, okay, now poor people go and do this thing. And so our philosophy is that there are these people who are positive deviants in their community who sort of know how to sort of get themselves out of poverty, but nobody's making those investments directly in them. So the data points that we're collecting are a lot of these sort of the usual suspect type of outcome indicators, but then it's also a strength-based data set. So we're collecting information on what are you doing in your community, what are your goals. And so part of how we use that information is we have a lot of this text data. So what I do is kind of take that text, turn it into the zeros and ones that Andrew was talking about, sort of turn that into data, and then mine that. And then we'll use that to adjust the types of financial products that we're making available.
So one of the things I'd be curious in your perspective on in particular, Nancy Loveland said data science is not overhead, but it doesn't mean it's cheap, right? It still requires a resource investment. So why has Family Independence Initiative chosen to make this investment? Why have they chosen to prioritize data?
Yeah, I think from the get-go, Family Independence Initiative is an organization that understands that data is important. I mean, they've been collecting information in this online monthly journal for a while. They have about 4,000 people that we're working with across the country right now. And they kind of just got to this point where they realized they didn't have the capacity to be working with all the information that's coming in order to sort of make the types of policy arguments that they really want to be able to make. They realized that they had to make the non-cheap investment.
Rob, you have a nice perspective with Salesforce, right? You're able to kind of see lots of different initiatives. Who do you think is doing good work in this area? Who's using the tools of data mining well to further their mission?
Yeah, I really see three trends emerging right now. One is Grameen, and a great example of Grameen is, if you look at it, they're doing microfinance loans out in the middle of Africa where there's no electricity, people cannot afford laptops, and they're able to track these microfinance loans on a mobile phone. And what's happening with that is they're able to track that back to their donors and report that back to their constituents in real time. That's something that without cloud computing was impossible before. So cloud computing has really changed the game. So that's the first trend. The second one that I think is a really compelling human interest story is Polaris Project. And if you look at what Polaris is doing, they initially came to us with a use case, which was we want to better extract people and individuals out of human trafficking situations. So what they did was they wanted to leverage mobile technologies where you text in, and these are very dangerous situations because people may only have minutes where they can be extracted. So it goes straight into a call center in Salesforce, which links up with local law enforcement, and they extract them. They're able to, again, report back to their donors in real time the impact. What was really interesting about that is the second trend is that you now have these social, mobile, open tools that are available, which actually begets greater data. And if you look at it from the perspective, from the perspective that 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years, this is one of the reasons why. More people are accessing their donors, their advocates, their constituents, students, alumni, et cetera. And what's happened is they realize, oh my gosh, By being able to report back how many people we've extracted and repatriated, we're also noticing hotspots. And when they notice these hotspots through all this data aggregation, they're now taking down human trafficking networks. So, and that is because of mobile, social, and open technologies. And so then when you look at this proliferation of data, then the third trend is this concept of analytics. And we all, I think, historically have been overwhelmed by the concept of having data scientists having to do this work. And there's a lot of organizations, we're one of them, but I know Tableau was up on stage earlier, but there's a lot of organizations that are really working on making analytics available for everyone, that we all can become data scientists. And an example that I can use on that, and I actually have my mobile phone here and I showed you earlier, but the thing is that we did this project with the UN called Project 8, and the goal of Project 8 is by 2025, they're trying to predict how many people there will be in the world. If we have 8 billion people in the world, what's the impact? But at a country, geopolitical level, as well as, what's the right word, just at an income distribution level. And what you can do is you can start to do predictive analytics to stop and prevent future catastrophes, so they can predict where there's going to be food or water shortages and jump on that information now. Now, I can slice and dice that information from my mobile phone, and I am not a technologist, and neither are most people in most organizations. But it's about structuring the data right, getting it in there, figuring out what you're trying to manage and report. And you can actually, it's been fun to play with. And you just sit there and you can report and look at what that impact is. So the three trends that I see emerging with all nonprofits is that in an underserved space, these three areas of cloud computing, making analytics available for everybody, and social open mobile technologies really changed the game.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think one of the things I oftentimes talk with social sector organizations is that, in some ways we're fundamentally different than the big data companies we read about in Harvard Business Review or Fast Company or things like that. Most of the major big data companies, the reason they exist is because of digital exhaust, right? There's basically no cost to data collection or storage, right, for them. Like if every time I searched, something in Google, they're like, some guy somewhere was like, oh, Andrew Means is searching for, Thai food in Chicago again, and I had to input it into a database. There's no way Google would be the company that it is. And yet that's oftentimes our world. And so I think it's interesting to see how technology is lowering the costs for data acquisition, storage, and collection in our world now. Right? We're moving beyond just digital exhaust tools to tools to make, decrease the costs that a lot of these organizations, our organizations, face. So I think those trends are absolutely right. I think the trends of technology are completely intertwined with the trends of data. So Mark, you are also doing some work on human trafficking, and you're actually using some of the tools of data mining in that work. Can you just share a little bit about what you're doing?
Sure. Well, sort of drawing on some of the technologies and tools that Rob just talked about, what we've been doing at USC actually for the last 5 years is, we have this hypothesis that all the digital breadcrumbs, the digital exhaust, the digital traces, which are happening across our digital ecosystem, is there a signal somewhere there where we can find evidence of human trafficking, someone in need? And so what we did was we, built tools like scraping tools and other analytic tools, and tools which essentially filtered millions of different posts and discussions on open fora and discussion boards, et cetera, to see if we can find what essentially is a needle in a haystack, which is evidence of a minor who is being abused and exploited sexually for commercial gain. And what this has really led to, which a lot of people are thinking about, which is how to use these tools to find real-time actionable information to address someone in need and help them. What has been sort of, I'd say, remarkable that in the last 5 years is that this idea of using technologies and tools and data to address human trafficking and other really serious social issues has reached the sort of highest levels of government and business and academia. So in 2012, President Obama talked about using technology to turn the tables on traffickers at Clinton Global Initiative. And then you have people from the private sector like Rob at Salesforce. You also have Google, Microsoft, Palantir, JP Morgan Chase, all getting into the human trafficking space, using and applying their analytics and tools for this social issue. So along the way, I kind of started thinking a little bit more deeply about the introduction of technologists and data scientists in these traditionally human sector type problems, which actually, hadn't seen a data scientist before, didn't know what they do and all that kind of stuff. And so sort of bridging these two worlds, I think, is hard. And the work I'm doing at the Data and Society Research Institute is thinking a little bit more deeply about the ethics of sort of data collection and analytics, from surveillance to privacy, and also some of the technical aspects like false positives and negatives and data validation.
Absolutely. I think you raised a really good point, and I'd be curious in all of our kind of perspectives on this, which is, in essence, a human capital question, right? The people that tend to choose data science as a career sometimes speak a different language than the people that choose to work at a nonprofit, right? I think we can say that. That's fair. How have you guys seen individuals and organizations overcome that challenge, overcome this, basically speaking two fundamentally different languages?
Well, something I observed is, from the sort of transition between sort of an idea, technology, and innovation in data science to its eventual application in the social space, there's this key role of a translator / broker. And so imagine a Venn diagram with two circles. And in one circle, you have the technologist, the data scientist. They can be in academia, in the private sector, or a software developer in a company. And then you have in the other circle, you have the subject matter experts, the policymakers in whatever domain it is. It could be trafficking, refugees, women's empowerment, whatever it is. And so as these circles sort of collide in some ways, that sort of overlapping integration area in that Venn diagram, at that point or intersection sits a translator. And this person is kind of toiling away, trying to get the subject matter experts to understand even the most basic vocabulary to talk about requirements to software developers or engineers. Or you have data scientists who really want to make an impact in the social impact space. However, they don't really know the first thing about vulnerable populations and how to deal with data in that space. And so kind of one of your earlier questions about what is data, asking that to a group of people, sort of what is data? What does data mean for you? What data is appropriate? Is it aggregated data? Is it personally identifiable information? Is it prediction? Or is it a representative sample from the entire population? Those are the sort of essential hard questions. And I think a lot of the people in this room are filling this translator role in some respect in our respective organizations.
David, what are your thoughts on that? In your role with Family Independence Initiative, do you see yourself primarily as a translator, primarily as a data scientist? How much of your work is spent doing translation versus maybe more working with ones and zeros?
There is a lot of translation, and more so a lot of saying, all right, this regression doesn't mean what you probably think it means. Right. Going back, though, more to your question more broadly, I think that there's sort of this wrong-headed belief that there are these sort of data scientist nerds over here, and then there's the social sector over here, and how do we lure these people away from Facebook and come and focus on our causes? And you probably don't, right? For me and Andrew also, we're both went to public policy school, and for me, I came up in the social sector, sort of turned technologist rather than technologist turned social sector. So I think part of the answer here is recognizing that there are these various types of data science tools, but that our sector should be investing in our own people acquiring those tools rather than just having to look from without our own sector to bring people in.
I think that's a really important point. I do think the people that I have seen really make progress in this space are social sector people turned technologists, right? People, myself, I stumbled across data because I was very interested in helping organizations identify what was working, right? And I was like, this is this amazing tool to do all these things, right? And I think that that's a really good point. But I would also, Rob, I'd be curious your thoughts on this. How do we, how does Salesforce help nonprofits gain some of this capacity, do some of this training, and gain skills to use tools and methods well when doing data mining and other kind of data analysis work?
It's a good question. I think one of the things that I'll give an example of, I spent probably about nearly 20 years working with the commercial sector. And than the past few years working with nonprofits and working with educational institutions. And there's this perception that this market has largely been underserved, and that is true because the technology was just prohibitively expensive. But the reality is that the needs are really the same. Nonprofits have, just commercial organizations have customers, nonprofits have donors, constituents, and you all need to be able to engage with certain ways. But the advice that I used to give commercial companies, the same advice that I would give to nonprofits and for good companies, or organizations, I should say, and it is that start off, I think sometimes these issues are over-engineered. You see people kind of get to a point where they're like, I'm not sure what to do or where to start. And actually, the starting point is actually simple. It's what is it you want to measure? What is it you want to report? And start there and structure your data around that. And then that just starting point, kind of getting that lift-off point and being able to kind of figure out how you want to structure it, how you want to measure it, and then you get this huge proliferation of data that begets data, where you all of a sudden are starting to get information. Now you want more information, which I think was kind of what I'm hearing. Like you guys fell into it by accident because you ended up becoming more and more curious, but it's that starting point, and it's keeping it simple with that starting point and then just getting people to lift off there. I think too many people are overwhelmed by it and taking a boil of the ocean approach. Technology right now has really simplified the end user experience as well as the back office kind of maintenance and management experience. And again, it's the trends in making analytics for everybody, cloud computing, social, mobile, open technologies that allow people to engage and touch it and feel it, just like a child does with an iPad. So I think that we're overwhelmed by it, but in reality, my advice would be keep it simple. Figure out what you're trying to measure and manage. The simplest reports first. Start there.
I think that's good advice. You raised one thing, though, that I think is interesting, right? Which is this idea that social sector organizations might just need the same kinds of technologies as private sector organizations. And I don't disagree with that, but I'm also not sure how much I agree with that. Because I think there are unique use cases, and there's unique, oftentimes we're working with information in different ways, right? Like one of the things I've been talking with a few people about, even over the last couple days, is the idea that data sharing is going to be much more important maybe in the social sector than it is amongst other private sector entities, because there's no way for us to, there's no nonprofit that has the market penetration of Amazon, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's some unique challenges. Do you guys, David, Mark, both of you, I'd be curious your thoughts. Do you see basically the social sector needs just matching up with private sector needs, or are there unique aspects to our work that require different technology, different tools, methods, things like that?
Well, I think when human rights and human security is concerned, I think the stakes are different, and the stakes, I don't know if they're necessarily higher, but I mean, you have, people's safety and security and lives really on the line, and so one can design and iterate and follow a kind of what people are used to in the computer science world and on how to sort of test technologies a little bit differently, I think, in the private sector, because what's at stake might just be, somebody didn't click on something. But when it comes down to, overlooking someone who's being abused or not finding that person that you're looking for, I think that's just a different calculus between risk, harms, and benefits. And I think developing those frameworks, particularly in the humanitarian development and human rights domains, I think does require a different type of calculus.
I think we have different applications of fundamental tools, but I mean, the concepts are the same. And I'm using the same types of algorithms or methodologies that Amazon is using, but I'm not trying to sell DVD box sets, right? So I think we have particular sort of application type needs, but I mean, fundamentally, statistics is statistics. Right?
Absolutely. So I think you were, Mark, raising some ethical considerations. I fall in the unabashed camp of data might be able to potentially save the world, which not everyone agrees with, I understand. So what are the risks of data mining in the social sector? Are there risks of data mining in the social sector, and how can we avoid them? Anyone want it?
I tend to agree with your camp on this one. I think that data can be used to do extraordinary things for good. Even that example I was giving on Project 8 with the UN, the ability to predict and forecast potential disasters coming based on resource shortages, in using data to do that rather than wait for it to happen is an extraordinary use case. Or the ability for an organization like Michael J. Fox Foundation to actually use data collection to be able to say, where is the best place to put our money and who are the researchers who are making the best advancements and be on top of that. What I work with and what I see more good.
Absolutely.
I mean, there's a quote that I'm sure a lot of people have heard before. It's from someone named Mel Kranzberg, an academic in 1986, and he said that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And, you know, sort of...
Leave it up to an academic to come up with that one.
That's right. So I think you might want to ask, you know, as you use technology or data to intervene in the field, you know, who is this tool empowering? You know, is it who is the ultimate beneficiary? Is it the actual sort of beneficiaries? Is it, you know, or who in the sort of stakeholder group is the one actually really being powered by the introduction of these tools and technologies? And you know, I think, you know, I don't disagree. I think I agree in some ways with our panelists in that, you know, it might have to come down to other types of tools with regard to something like risk management or decision science. You know, so it's what kind of data and what kind of analysis are appropriate for what kinds of interventions at what times. I think it's those types of sort of inputs and variables that would make, I guess, decision making a little bit more richer, particularly in sort of spaces where there's vulnerable people and the social consequences are quite high.
So I want to turn a little bit to some of the actual uses of data mining in the sector and examples that, you know, some of us have seen. So when it comes to, like, or what a better way to ask this, what are the kinds of problems that nonprofits are turning to data mining to solve?
And so in our case, we have a number of use cases. One of those is we're working on a concept that we're calling the initiative score. And so you can kind of think about it like an alternative FICO score. And so part of how we're using that is in making loan predictions based upon alternative types of information. So instead of using your credit history, which a lot of the families we're working with don't have, using the various types of information that we're sort of collecting from them and the things that they're doing. A challenge that we have in that is that a lot of the loans that we make, that people aren't defaulting, right? Which, as an organization, FII celebrates, like, hey, look, there's a lot of reliability here. People aren't defaulting on these loans. As an analyst, I mean, I need failures in order to build a model, right? I mean, so basically, I run the model, and it says, like, well, if somebody gets a loan from FII, then they'll pay it back. Like, great.
Rob, what's some of the other use cases that you're seeing throughout the sector where people are maybe even coming at that intersection of technology and analytics in creative ways?
Yeah, actually, I think there's a few people in here from Europe. I just saw the attendee list, but Europe, like, here's a great one. They're looking at the effectiveness of their programs, and they're analyzing, what's working, what's not working, and they're looking at kind of wage, salary increases after completing certain courses, et cetera. And they're analyzing this data. And what's really interesting is in talking to Wells from Europe, there's also another group of people, and I was just talking to one of them outside, who are looking to kind of share that data. And they're looking to kind of, like, as you mentioned earlier, collaborate and get one common data source to kind of look at what's working in education, what's not working in education. Your graphic, 70%, I love that one. And your whole presentation was really making the point that they're all making, which is that, look, we should be able to collaborate and share this data and be able to kind of do better predictive analysis to where, what students might fall, in trouble at certain points, or what programs are really working, double down on these programs, what ones aren't, and increase that. And what I do really like about this sector more than anybody is the willingness, than any other sector that's out there in the commercial space, is that it's the willingness to work with each other to solve problems. I would say Europe is a tremendous example of somebody using analytics to basically increase the outcome and education experience and make sure that we can take disadvantaged people and get them into better education and employment status.
Absolutely.
About 5 years ago, when I started talking about, data collection, analytics could be used to intervene in human trafficking, people looked at me like I was crazy, particularly in that field. Fast forward 5 years, and it's almost taken as a given. So, frankly, I see almost any major social issue, the question about how data can be applied in that arena or area, I think will be asked. Just even now with migration in Europe, people are talking about drones and using social media and sort of collecting mobile phone records to try to see where the boats are, who's on them, how many people, where they're going, and are they calling for help. And so, I think one way to sort of mitigate against sort of risk and harm when using these types of data interventions is, kind of what Rob was saying, getting people to work together, putting people in the room, getting some translators or brokers in the room, but, getting, so as technologists and, the private sector wants to help in these endeavors and situations, sort of getting a beneficiary in the room to speak from their own experience about how they use data or how it could be used, or how they've sort of used technology, which could be helpful. And getting other subject matter experts, maybe not always the ones that you might expect to be in a room, but a small NGO, which is in country, just to give that context as we go into the field with these technologies.
So I have one more question, but then we'll open it up to you guys, and I want to see a line at both microphones in 3 minutes. If there's an organization here, an executive director or whoever, and they're thinking, I want to do something with this data thing, where should they begin? Like, what are the first steps that you would encourage the average nonprofit to take to begin exploring how data can help their organization?
Well, I think, as was being said earlier, first having a pretty clear picture as to, what questions do you want to have answered. We were having a discussion earlier with a foundation, and they were wondering, like, well, is there a lot of point in us using data? And I asked them, well, what questions do you want to answer, and more importantly, what decisions is the answer going to affect? If you don't have a question where information is going to affect the decision that you make, then you basically don't have room for information. Concretely identifying what is that question and what are the alternative paths that may happen as a result of that question. In terms of sort of taking a first step, jumping in, I would say, instead of thinking about the sort of big, hire that you need to make, work with people on a consulting basis. I started with FII as a consultant, and then that sort of whet their appetite for what was possible. Maybe looking to Andrew and doing a consultant engagement first, and then kind of taking it from there.
I would just go back to, I said this earlier, but I agree with what David said wholeheartedly, and I would say just the best place to start is figure out what you're trying to ask, what you're trying to discover, what you're trying to learn. Start simple. Don't be afraid to start. Don't let the boil of the ocean or the overwhelming concept stop you from just getting in. But ask the simple questions. What are we trying to solve? What are we trying to measure? And then that data and just capturing that data informs you about the next wave of iteration you need to make. And then data begets data. But you can start off taking one step at a time, and you'd be surprised how quickly it can accelerate in a very efficient way. But I agree wholeheartedly with everything David said.
Absolutely.
I would say too, maybe hiring a data scientist maybe isn't the first step. Maybe it's sort of hiring an Andrew or a data kind or a translator, basically, just to see how to articulate the questions that you're interested in. And then I think sort of thinking a little bit early on about, for lack of a better word, the ethics, or even the sort of the risks. So, what kind of privacy concerns do I have? Do I have to do a risk assessment or a privacy risk assessment? How is this data going to be stored? What happens if the data is sort of released without, unintendedly, and those types of things? And essentially thinking through some of the inadvertent consequences early to sort of get in front of any potential issues.
Absolutely. So I'd love to see any of your questions. Feel free to come on up to the mic. Yeah, over here. Look at this, a line. You guys are, this is amazing. Thank you. All right, great. Over here.
So my question is about when you're talking about predictive versus causal. If you're working in a social service program, let's say a social skills program for kids with autism, so you could be doing things where you're measuring the number of friends that somebody has over time. That's very quantitative. But how do you develop a data mining strategy if you're looking at maybe the quality of those relationships? How do you go about measuring that, especially when you're trying to increase explanatory power by sacrificing predictiveness?
Okay. So I want to address your question from with a story that I had, right? So one of my first jobs out of graduate school was the director of research and analytics at the YMCA of Chicago. And I got there, and I'm like, so what is it that you guys do? And they're like, we build character. And I was like, okay. I was like, all right. And they're like, we'd like you to measure that. And I'm like, okay, right? So I think a lot of our work does involve these intangibles that we are really driving towards. But I think there are lots of things correlated with that. And this is how we approached it, right? So I would work with our programs and I'd say, so what does character mean to you? Right? Like, how do you know that kid A has more character than kid B? Right? Like, what are the observable things? And we would try to drive some of these observables. And so for us, we became, in that example with the YMCA, we started looking we cared a lot more about grades than test scores. Because grades are much more correlated with your ability to turn your homework in on time, and ask your teacher when you don't know something, all these kinds of things that were like, that's like more like the kid that we kind of are trying to create than test scores, which is just purely cognitive ability. And so the way I would begin to address that question is, what are the observable things that you really are trying to drive towards, and build models around those, but knowing that we're not fully capturing what it is that we even really want to capture, right? I was talking with somebody about this yesterday. We were talking about IQ. Right? We treat IQ as this thing that's inside your head, and we're able to order people perfectly upon it, all these kinds of things. That's not how IQ was ever meant to even be used, right? And so I think the real danger comes when we start building models and using them in inappropriate ways. But I think there are ways to say, what are the observable things that we do want to see changed, along with the kind of underlying intangible that we might be working towards? Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Cool, thanks. How about over here?
Hey guys, great panel. Cam Caldwell from Socrata. The first thing I wanted to say is, although these guys are dressed very smartly and are even leaning at the same angle, that's impressive. It's like your backing band.
Yeah, I like it. Andrew Means and the Dating Nerds. Welcome.
What I was going to say is Andrew's the only one with a tie on. So yeah. my question is that, talking about data science and analyzing data, in my experience, one of the hardest things for these projects is actually data prep and data cleansing, and it's not a very sexy part of the project, but it needs to get done. And my question is, how much of your time when you're doing one of these projects do you allocate to data prep, data cleansing to get the data into the format where you can do the science?
A lot. So when I first joined FII, the first thing I focused on, and by first thing I mean a several-month project, was focusing on automating all of those workflows. What they were doing prior to my joining was every time they had a question, they would sort of download it, manipulate it in the format that they needed, and then go from there. So I've sort of developed this automated process that goes out, extracts the data from our database vendor, then automates all of that massaging. And so a principle that I have in FII is that you should sort of write a query once and then run it forever. So that every time we do one of these data dives 6 months later, I don't have to go and answer the same question again. That model exists, but it sort of pulls in the new data. So a lot of time is that data janitor work, but through automation, you can sort of get that part more or less out of your life.
And I think there's actually an increasing number of tools that are doing some interesting stuff around data cleaning that you can tap into and use for that work. And then two, this was something that Lindsay was saying from Schoolzilla a little bit ago that I just want to so just like +1 to, which is if you're asking somebody to give you data, give it back to them in a way that's valuable for them, right? Then it aligns their incentives, right? Like we see this problem all across our sector, right? Like I saw it even when I was at the YMCA. I would ask all these frontline staff to send me data, and they're like, I never see it again. I don't really care, it's 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And I would get that, and it would be like completely useless, right? But as soon as I started giving them reports back, giving them information back that was meant to help them do their job better, like the data cleaned itself like that, right? And I think we need to, as a sector, stop asking people, like doing this one-way communication with data, which is like, give me your data, and then I'm just going to store it over here and never touch it again. But thank you for making it so clean and wonderful, right? Like, this is ridiculous. So I think we need to I think there's obviously tools, and I think automating things is super important, but I think there's also ways we can change the systems around data collection as well. Thank you. Over here.
So I'm glad you asked that question because I want to take it one step back even further, which is just the database itself. So I come from the B2B world, and I'm working now in the nonprofit world. And we seem to have, for smaller nonprofits, a lot of really hard-coded relational databases that I can't share anything with you because I can't even find it unless I ask it in a very specific way. Yeah. So if you were talking to a smaller nonprofit today, how would you advise us to look for the right database technology that will allow us to do these things and move out from there for the next 5 years?
So I'll let Rob answer that first, and then I'll tell you what I think. No.
I think the main thing is that, first of all, something that's just basically built on open standards and commonly used.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the problems that, when this sector, there's a perception that it's been underserved. The perception is somewhat accurate, but sometimes I think we underserve ourselves by trying to go do it ourselves and creating all these proprietary systems, which then becomes more expensive in the long run. And I do think that there's something that David said earlier too. It's like, and as well as Andrew, is that there's a lot of data extraction tools. There's also a lot of consulting resources there, not big money consulting resources there that can actually come in and help you extract that data, clean it up, but then get it into a standardized tool, a standardized database, an open system, like something that can integrate easily with everything. And I think that that's one of the big advantages of cloud computing is like it's open standards. It can integrate with everything. You can extract and get information in and out of it easily. But I think the dilemma that this all starts from is that we sometimes try and save costs by doing it ourselves. But when you look at the staff time, the maintenance and managing of those systems, and the scalability as your organization grows or its needs grow, it becomes prohibitively expensive. Does that answer your question, sort of?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, exactly. I think the biggest thing that when I work with smaller organizations in particular, is that when you're making database decisions, one, you're generally not buying a database, you're buying the front end to a database, right? But make sure that you can extract the data really easily, right? There's a surprising number of database vendors that make it really, really hard for you to actually access your own data, right? And I think that's ridiculous. It's your data, right? Like, so that's the biggest thing I would say. And then two, for larger entities, I'm seeing a big shift away from SaaS models and paying for those kinds of large database solutions and a move towards using open source technology. Because on the database side, like the pure database, none of the front end stuff, but the pure database architecture, there's some really good open source solutions. So for example, I was the chief data officer for the city of Chicago. He's trying to systematically stop paying license fees and like transfer that to like human capital costs for people that can build an open source and maintain an open source database system for them fairly easily. So those are, I think, but they're definitely challenges. Over here.
Yeah, so since you're all up there and you're all smart, and we're talking about prediction, I just thought it would be really interesting to get your opinions on where we're at with prediction and where we could get to with prediction in the social sector. How good can we get, or where are we at?
So where are we, guys, with prediction?
I think, I'll give a really quick answer. I think that we are headed towards a whole new level of prediction and intelligence because of, if you look at this data aggregation that's going on right now, I already gave the statistics, so I won't again, but I mean, if you look at it, there's this massive proliferation of data. But there's also this proliferation of organizations, one of them mine, one of them Tableau, and then there's a lot of people who are trying to make analytics available for everybody. This democratization of the ability to extract this information, collect this information, make it easy to gather so that the average end user can actually access it rather than having to go back and forth with IT in the scenario that you described. I think we're heading towards a world where we are going to be much more intelligent and have much better tools because the average user can use them. And I'll leave it at that. I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and I'll be the pessimist on the panel. I don't think we're much of anywhere. And I don't think that we'll really be able to get much of anywhere until organizations start really investing in this capacity. I think that these tools are great. I think a risk with sort of leaving all of that to tools is that a lot of the work that I'm doing, and I think that a lot of people who consider themselves data scientists do, is not just sort of pressing a button and getting a result, but then interpreting that result, right? I think it's very easy to make the wrong inference. So, I mean, it's great having all of these tools, but I think really as a sector, we need to invest in having the capacity to interpret what these models are telling us within our organizations.
And I'm glad I'm not the only pessimist on the panel. I thought I was for a little while. But I mean, I think as prediction actually does get better, I think the same questions which I talked a little bit about will become even more important, which is sort of how is the sort of prediction on a issue of social importance, how is that going to be governed? What's the accountability for those decisions based on those predictions? And what's the value of things like transparency and openness when these predictions are based on algorithms with a machine learning component that even the creator cannot understand? It's just too opaque. And so I think those questions are going to be elevated as predictive models get better.
I think, from my perspective, having done this even just for a few years, in one sense, I think we've come a really long ways, but that's only because we started from so far behind. So for example, we had not a large, not a like a medium-sized work readiness program work with us to predict who was likely to drop out of their program so they could provide them additional services and increase their kind of success. That never would have happened 4 years ago, right? Where somebody would have allocated money to do that kind of work. That said, those cases are way too few and far between. I think we have a long ways to go in the ways that we can use prediction and things like that in this sector. So our last question, and we'll give ourselves 30 seconds to answer from you. Go for it.
If you want. Hi, Sasha Littman from Measuring Success. First of all, love the panel. Thought you guys did a great job really laying out all the different steps. In our experience, working with a lot of these same trends, the data cleaning, aggregation, analytics, interpretation, training, et cetera, the one theme that's consistent is this doesn't happen overnight. And actually, in the Stanford Social Innovation Review on all that was distributed, we actually wrote a piece on this on page 57, which is actually on this point. But more importantly, it doesn't it's a real struggle. We've observed it doesn't happen overnight. So my question is, how do we help, especially the funders who are providing the capital, to allow our sector to be able to do this, especially when it comes to predictive analytics, which requires a lot of sharing of data? How do we help the funders and the organizations understand the timeline that it really requires to really integrate this into the organization, because it can't happen overnight? And how do we get the patience, the patient capital that we need, if you will, to get there?
Anyone have a quick thought on that? I'll take it. So I think that what we need to emerge are really strong intermediaries. Organizations like ours, like Bayes, like DataKind, like others that can connect those two worlds and provide the human capital to fill the gap that we currently have in the sector, to work with funders across multiple entities. Because I think data science is an area that requires some level of scale in some sense, right? I think we have this obsession with big data that I think is ridiculous. You can answer really important questions with any amount of data, with small data, things like that. But there are some questions, especially in the predictive side, where larger scale helps. And I think that's why we need to have intermediaries emerge. And I think they're beginning to emerge more and more. Even Peter York's organization Algorithm, ours, Plenty out in Chicago that's doing some stuff in fundraising that are taking really smart kind of data science approaches to their work and working with a large variety of entities. So I think I'm seeing more and more funders to have that conversation with organizations like ours that are trying to say, how can we support you as you support the sector in the field? And I think that's the way to do it. But I think you raised a really important question, which is, as a sector, we don't know how to value this work yet. We don't know what it's worth. We don't know how much to pay for it, right? We know how much it costs, but we don't know if it's worth that. And I think we need more proof points showing the value of this work and how it can not just make our organizations use their resources more efficiently and effectively, but to the end of solving the problems that we want to solve. So thank you so much, everybody, for your questions. Thank you to our panel.